that I've seen come online are really in the trenches of peace and justice work, and so that song is dedicated to you. And not only have you been listening to John McCutcheon, but in the video box of your webinar screen, you can see it's a bit fuzzy, but you can see a piece of art that I've had the camera trained on. This is an art piece by a South Korean political prisoner from the 1980s. And it's a picture of a Korean family in flight. And it was done by this political prisoner while he was in prison. And that the image has always reminded me of the Holy Family traveling as displaced people and as refugees. And I also wanted to share that with you. Kyun Her, our Korean friend from Los Angeles. I'm sorry that I don't remember the name of this political prisoner, but next time you're up to visit, you can look at the piece of art and see his name. It's in Korean. I can't read it. So I'm going to turn the intrepid video camera back on myself, and again, welcome each of you to this webinar. I'm working with Tim Nafziger over there at the console. Charlita is out of town at the moment en route. But behind me, you can see the beautiful wreath that she made out of rosemary and toyon. We're really glad that you have joined us. You see up under notes at the top of your page that if you have any technical difficulties that you can't work out during the webinar, give a call to Tim Nafziger. He's standing by with his phone. And there's a couple of other announcements there as well. We're going to go ahead and get started. And again, we're so glad that each of you have joined us. There are some 30 or so of you from around North America, including at least 5 Canadians, 3 Australians, and 1 person from Norway. So that's really lovely to have 4 continents at least represented. Thanks for coming on board. I think there's a couple of groups on tonight, the Portland crew and perhaps a few others. Remember, you've got a chat function down in the bottom right-hand corner, and if you want to chat your presence, particularly if you have groups, let us know. With that, we will get underway. But the first thing we want to do tonight is we want to mark the fact that today is exactly the first anniversary of our little webinar experiment at BCM. We've been running programs since December 13th, 2011. And over the last 12 months, we've done some great programming. Soon after the first of the year, you will be receiving a survey from us to evaluate your webinar experience, whether this is your first one or whether you've participated in a number. We'd really appreciate your honest feedback, particularly those of you who have been with us since the beginning. I think you've seen some improvement, but we're trying to continue to make this better and better. I want to just quickly run through the webinars that we have hosted over the past year so that our newer viewers in particular can see the breadth and depth of the kinds of topics we've been dealing with. So, and I'm going to do it backwards chronologically. Last month was a webinar on the prophetic protest over deforestation, biblical and contemporary. That was part of our eco-justice series. On the eve of Halloween, we did a program on the Triduum of Saints and the art of remembering. In September, we looked at restorative justice as it pertains to historical violations, looking particularly at the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation experiments, as well as Greensboro. And in August, we commemorated the 10th anniversary of my mentor, LaDon Sheets' passing by telling his story and talking about the art of hospice. In July, last summer, we looked at the epistle to the Ephesians as a manifesto of Christian peacemaking, since those texts were coming up in the Revised Common Lectionary readings that month. We took June off to change our webinar platform. Before that, in May, we celebrated Pentecost by looking at Genesis 11 and Acts 2 as narratives about multicultural insurgency. April's program commemorated the coinciding of the 20th anniversary of the Los Angeles Uprising and Holy Week. And March, we marked World Water Day with another eco-justice program focusing on water in the Bible. Last February, we celebrated the publication of our most recent publication, Our God is Undocumented. One of the faith-based immigrant rights activists profiled in that book is Del McCormick, whom you see in the upper left-hand part of this slide. She is on the webinar tonight, and later on you'll get to hear from her at length. Del has endeavored to embody tonight's theme in her work and her witness, so a particular welcome to Del McCormick, and there may be a few of her friends on tonight as well. In January, we returned to basics and looked at Mark's call to discipleship in its social and political context, and exactly 1 year ago today, we began this experiment in online education by focusing again on Advent in the context of both the Occupy movement and the witness of Posadas Sin Fronteras. So today, we'd like to complete the cycle of this first year. And since we began our series by acknowledging the Posadas Sin Fronteras theme, I want to begin tonight again by recognizing that just last Saturday, the 19th annual Posadas Sin Fronteras was held at the U.S.-Mexico border. This is an amazing experiment in public liturgy, and I'm deeply gratified that because, as we talked at length about a year ago, I had the honor of helping begin this tradition, which was the brainchild of my former colleague at the American Friends Service Committee, the late Roberto Martinez, who is also featured in the Our God is Undocumented book, and to whom it is dedicated. While the Posadas Sin Fronteras won't be the focus of this year's Advent webinar, I do want to commend this tradition to you, and I hope that some of you from near and far will think about joining us next year in San Diego for the Posada, since that will be its 20th year. Now, another of the fruits of last year's inaugural BCM webinar was a conversation that it helped animate in Canada among our friends in the Kairos Ecumenical Peace and Justice movement, particularly Jennifer Henry and Sarah Stratton, who are pictured here. That conversation at Kairos led to a commitment among them to use the theme of Posadas in their Advent resource booklet that they came out with about a month ago. For many in Canada who are using this resource all across the country, they're learning about Posadas for the first time. It's a wonderful resource in which each of the 4 weeks of Advent, a particular social justice theme is focused upon. And I just want to shout out to our Canadian partners in gratitude for this great resource. And you see the URL there if you want to order it, because we're only halfway through Advent. And that's Jennifer Henry chiming in the chat box. So thanks again for Kairos for this great resource. I want to turn to the topic now of tonight's webinar. But first, a note, and that is that Elaine was scheduled to do this webinar with me originally, but her schedule changed and she's not with us tonight. She is, however, focusing herself tonight on a story of internal displacement not so different from our gospel narrative that we're going to be studying, namely the history of the Japanese internment camps during World War II. As we speak tonight, Elaine is touring 20 middle and high schoolers to the Manzanar Camp Monument in Northern California. So I'm sure she'd appreciate it if you say a prayer for her as she tours those kids through that very powerful commemorative site. We're about halfway through the season of Advent, and as is our practice tonight, we want to focus on the lectionary readings that we use in our churches. The problem, as always, is that Advent and Christmas offer a particularly odd patchwork of gospel texts in this year, Year C, the year of Luke's gospel. For example, we don't actually get around to the Christmas story proper until week 4 of Advent, at which point we read about the birth of John the Baptist, whom we've already met as an adult in weeks 2 and 3 of Advent. And then we hear about Jesus. In other words, it's a little chronologically challenging. So what I want to do is just overview very quickly the texts of the Nativity story for Advent and Christmastide. Sorry about a little bit of the formatting here. We began Advent with, in the first week, with an excerpt from Jesus' portents about the end of the world, taken from the conclusion of Jesus' ministry. And then we proceed rather abruptly in weeks 2 and 3 to the work and witness of John the Baptist in the wilderness. These weeks offer us 3 opportunities, however, to learn the context of the Nativity story. Whereas the second 3 weeks of the season, that is the weeks of 4th Advent and Christmastide, which we're coming up on to now, provide an opportunity to tell that story. The cycle actually culminates on Epiphany, the traditional 12th day of Christmas. Somebody coming in. Which focuses on the 3 magi from the east coming to the Holy Family, which is from Matthew's account. So that's the somewhat confusing lectionary overview, and what I want to do is just say a quick word about several of these themes. I'm not going to belabor them, particularly the weeks that have already passed, but I'll summarize them to set the context for our focus tonight. As I said, in the first week of Advent, we get the Apocalyptic Prelude. The end has to precede the beginning. These apocalyptic texts traditionally begin the Advent season, and they speak of the world unraveling. As you can see here, Luke 21 draws on 2 images of judgment from Isaiah. In short, I think the logic of the lectionary is this. As the old liturgical cycle draws to a close and the new church year opens, the world is turning. So the apocalyptic mood is appropriate. More so, the birth of Jesus signals the dawn of a new order. So it makes sense that we would reflect on the old order passing away. Above all, for us modern people, I think apocalyptic tones in Scripture invite us to reflect on all the ways in which our current world order is unsustainable and must be deconstructed to make room for other possibilities. The ecological crisis that represents a historical endgame in our generation is only the most dramatic case in point. I believe this is the function of the first Sunday of Advent, to kickstart our political imagination about what is possible and what is important. All the way up to the tops of the house. We're doing a little adjustment on the microphone to see if the sound can be a little clearer. How's that, Tim?
I think that's better. Yes. Okay.
The gospel readings for the second week in Advent, which we heard last Sunday, demonstrate how the evangelist Luke's story begins in real political space. In other words, this is not a fairy tale. Luke begins by naming the most powerful and visible rulers of the Roman Empire relevant to the Palestinian context. Tiberius Caesar Augustus was the second emperor of Rome. Pilate was the face of the empire in Palestine. And Herod Antipas ruled from the years 4 before the Common Era to the year 39 after the Common Era. He was one of the 3 sons of Herod the Great. Antipas is prominent in the New Testament because he was the tetrarch over Galilee and Perea, the 2 areas in which both John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth did most of their work. Finally, Luke names the high priests, the putative leaders of the nation of Israel, though their actual power had been eviscerated under the colonial arrangement. In other words, Luke is listing these players in order of their political power, reminding the reader of the painful arrangements of colonial Palestine under the Romans. So the Jesus story begins in the real political space of imperial occupation, in stark contrast to the sentimental, fuzzy, apolitical landscapes of our nativity scenes, which, for all intents and purposes, might have as well have occurred in Disneyland. But after naming all of the rulers of this very real world, Luke suddenly tells us that God's word comes not to any of them, but to John the Baptist in the wilderness, which is to say at the edge of society. What a contrast. The word of God breaks in not from above, but from below, not at the centers of power, but at the margins. That is the essential political geography of the gospel. And if and when we forget it, we will get the whole story wrong. This locator also means to remind us of the origins of Israel's faith. John the Baptist stands in the tradition of the wilderness, both in the footsteps of Hebrew prophets and of the Exodus God Yahweh, whose word comes from outside the structures of civilization. John invites his people to repentance, quoting Isaiah and heralding the radical leveling of the world of Roman Palestine, a society that was characterized by the excesses of wealth and poverty. But in John's vision, the high places will be brought low and the low places lifted up. We will shortly hear an echo of that in Mary's Magnificat. So the second Sunday of Advent is about how God enters our world at the margins, yet means to turn this world upside down. Do I need to turn that on?
Turn it right in there. And then just
I've now adjusted the volume of my microphone. We'll see if that's any better. Moving on to third Advent, which is this coming Sunday. It gives us a glimpse of John the Baptist's message of repentance, which is a call to an entire people to radically alter their historic direction, not just for an individual change of heart. Note that John's analysis is radical. It goes to the root, using his metaphor. And John is using apocalyptic language of fire and the harvest. In particular, John attacks the theology of entitlement among his people, which is very much also still a problem today, our belief in our own nobility and innocence and invulnerability. But John's message is also practical. He suggests step-by-step measures. They're concrete, as indicated by verses 10 to 15 in Luke 3. Share with each other. Refuse to exploit others in your jobs. I think it's significant that John's approach embodies a radical analysis and yet practical responses. That's a very good dialectic and a fruitful focus for third Advent. This brings us to fourth Advent, really, and the heart of this webinar. Now, this year, fourth Advent doesn't come until the day before Christmas Eve. At last, we come here to this Christmas story proper. We've had to wait for it. It's as if the old wisdom of Advent is constraining us, trying to perhaps inoculate us against holiday triumphalism and sentimentality. If we've understood the context of Luke's story properly in the first 3 weeks of Advent, it will be a lot less difficult and shocking to proclaim an undomesticated nativity in our churches. I want to focus tonight on 4 very powerful themes in Luke's story, though some of them are only partially correlated to our lectionary readings. They're listed here. I want to talk about the gender politics of the story. I want to talk about this amazing relationship between 2 women pregnant with prophets. I want to mention the tradition of revolutionary Christmas carols in Luke, and finally talk about the spectacle of a Messiah in a feed trough. So let's talk about the first theme, the extraordinary gender dynamics in Luke's narrative. Now, Luke 1 is the prolegomenon to the Nativity story. And as you know, it's structured around the stories of two women who, for radically different reasons, cannot conceive. Elizabeth is too old, Mary is too young. Their stories are told synoptically throughout Luke 1, that is, in parallel, as you can see from this chart. Both women are visited by the angel Gabriel, after which both conceive sons who we are told will become prophets, who will change the course of the nation. These annunciations suggest that God is sneaking into the world not only at the margins of the physical and political landscape, as in the story of John the Baptist, but here also in the somatic and social landscape as well. The Zechariah and Elizabeth narrative is clearly patterned after the old tale of Abraham and Sarai, told in Genesis 17 and 18. But this time it's the man, moreover a priest, who is upbraided by the heavenly messenger because of his incredulity at the promise of a child. In Luke 1, 5-25, Zechariah is struck silent. His wife Elizabeth, on the other hand, not only embraces the vision, but becomes the very center of the story. Even more extreme is Mary, who is no sooner introduced as a young woman pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, verse 127, then her husband disappears from the rest of the Annunciation narrative. It's all about Mary. Moreover, while Zechariah remains silent and Joseph invisible, both Elizabeth and Mary find their voices in significant pronunciations. We should not discount how subversive such gendered narratives were in the patriarchal world of antiquity, or for that matter, still today. At only one point in the prolegomenon of Luke 1 do these two female characters at the center of the parallel stories actually meet, and that is the reading for Fourth Advent, the Gospel reading. It's an extraordinary moment. Two women, one old and one young, both pregnant with prophets, greet each other. It seems that their fetuses recognize each other in a magical leap that one theologian has called a theology of the womb. Just as significant is the fact that these are village women of no particular significant estate. We have to keep in mind that the biographical literature of Roman antiquity, much like the infotainment media in our culture, focused incessantly and exclusively upon rich and famous personalities as its subjects. The Gospels, however, in contrast, feature poor folk as the true protagonists of history. We might even hear in these tales a faint echo of the conspiracy of women that preserved the life of the prophet Moses back in the old story of Exodus 1 and 2. We'll return to this in a moment.
Push the microphone again.
This unlikely chosenness is underlined by Elizabeth's response, which utters a fascinating triple blessing, noted here in yellow, upon womanhood. This is, by any measure, a profound break from patriarchal mores and from the male domination of ancient narratives. In Luke, it is women who recognize the blessing, the mystery, and the conspiracy of life, which is to say, they are the outsiders God's preferred vessels to get important things done. The other reading for the fourth Sunday of Advent is Mary's famous response to her elder Elizabeth, the Magnificat, which comes in the Psalms slot of the lectionary. This brings us to a third architectural characteristic of Luke's narrative, the three famous Canticles. They're known liturgically as the Magnificat, the Benedictus, and the Nunc Dimittis. These titles are derived from the opening words of each canticle in Latin. This is the reason why we properly sing Christmas carols during this season, by the way. It's indigenous to our biblical tradition. Now, if only we could recover the revolutionary tenor of these songs. So let's look at them each briefly. The first part of Mary's song is personal. She has been recognized. As a servant girl, frankly, she is as astonished as would have been the ancient reader. It is still extraordinary that God works through the least, unnoticed by all those whose gaze is preoccupied with the Caesars and the Pilates, the Herods and the high priests of our worlds. No single aspect of the gospel perspective is more essential. History is not transformed at its center, but at its margins, among the poor. The second part of the song is about God demonstrating extraordinary strength. Now, I want to focus on this for a minute because it's pretty ironic and pretty profound, given that God has chosen a peasant girl, a slave girl. So I want to stay with this for a moment. What is being spoken of here? Is it some sort of alternative power ignored by the proud? And is that power mysteriously lodged in oppressed women who are giving birth in the face of empire? Well, this might seem to be a stretch to some. In fact, this very notion is articulated later in the New Testament in John's Apocalypse, and I want to take a brief detour there. In Revelation chapter 12, John the Revelator has a vision of a woman struggling to give birth in the face of a beast who threatens incalculable violence. You see the text here. This is a woman clothed with the sun, who is pregnant, crying out in birth pangs. And this dragon wishes to devour her child. Now, in Revelation, the dragon is one of John's master symbols of his apocalyptic text. Remember, John was a political prisoner of the Roman Empire in the late 1st century of the Common Era, not too long probably after Luke's Gospel was written. In Revelation, the dragon stands for the lethal violence of empire. This dragon's intent is to devour the child. It's a clear allusion to the old Exodus story of Pharaoh's war on the Hebrew firstborn, in which, as we mentioned earlier, it was a conspiracy of women who rescued the kid from the king. Of course, Matthew's gospel tale of Herod's slaughter of the innocents is patterned on this Exodus story, Exodus 1 and 2. And although Luke doesn't mention Matthew's pogrom, it's legitimate to wonder if there is an implied connection. After all, like the Levite mother of Moses and like Mary of Nazareth, the woman of Revelation 12 is giving birth to a son in the teeth of the dragon, nurturing life in defiance of the power of death. Now, as Catholics are well aware, the woman of Revelation 12 is also described as being clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, and crowned with stars. This evocative celestial image can only be an allusion to Mary of Nazareth, or at least that's how Catholic iconography has interpreted Revelation 12. Because, of course, Mary is celebrated as the woman clothed with the sun in the beautiful image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patroness of indigenous peasants who were displaced by Spanish colonization in Mexico and still today throughout the American Southwest. Now, there's a whole story of Guadalupe here that will perhaps be the subject of next year's Advent webinar. For now, it's enough to recognize that the connections between Luke's Mary and Revelation 12's woman are substantial. And after all, yesterday was the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It is one of the keystone events of Advent and always belongs in the discussion of these stories. So there's lots of what scholars call intertextuality going on in these images and these stories. One last note about John's vision of the woman clothed with the sun. His account continues with the strange story reiterated 3 times in Revelation 12 of this woman taking refuge in the wilderness. The revelator is clearly drawing on the old Exodus motif of Israel's escape from Pharaoh into the desert. But whereas in that old story, creation joins the rebellion rising up against the empire in the famous series of plagues, here the wilderness receives and protects the woman from the dragon's violence. This nurturing hospitality gives new meaning to the term Mother Nature. Given that Luke's Gospel reserves a special place not only for women, but indeed for the female image of Sophia, the connections we're drawing here seem more than legitimate. Jesus himself, later in the Gospel, seems to reflect the influence of a very strong mother by invoking this tradition in his warning to skeptics who were resisting his message. Wisdom, he says, Sophia, is justified by her children. In fact, Jesus is a child of Mary's Sophia. And imagine having the Magnificat sung to you as a nursery rhyme. No wonder he was a revolutionary. Which brings us back now to the amazing hymn of Mary. The next verses are perhaps the most subversive in our entire biblical tradition. And they make it clear that Scripture is not shy about envisioning a radical social leveling. The promise is a social one, promising justice to the poor, and then in verse 54, a political one, about Yahweh's faithfulness to the people of the covenant. Now, all of these elements in the Magnificat are a reiteration of an older story, of Hannah's song, which we find in 1 Samuel chapter 2. The story there is of the birth of the prophet Samuel to a woman who, like Elizabeth in Luke's account, is too old to get pregnant. Clearly, Luke has used this 1 Samuel story as a pattern for his nativity. After all, Samuel will grow up to warn Israel against taking on a king, just as both John the Baptist and Jesus will grow up to challenge the powers of their world. So there's amazing consonance and resonance between 1 Samuel 2 and the Magnificat, and I encourage you to do a study where you read those two synoptically, because there are just simply so many echoes and resonances between them. In other words, Mary's Magnificat is a recontextualization of an ancient hymn about liberation and about turning the world upside down. This was and remains an incredible tradition of women's revolutionary music, and who would have thought that it's right here at the heart of Scripture. Let me say a briefer word about another canticle that we've encountered in Advent already. Last week, in the second week of Advent, in the Psalm slot was the Benedictus. When the priest Zechariah finally regains his voice in Luke 1 upon the birth and naming of John, he sings another messianic tune. I just want to point out two aspects of this canticle. First, it's clearly another hymn to liberation from captivity and from a hostile enemy. You see the refrain in yellow. This is a song that names Israel's occupation by a brutal ruler who hates his subjects, which is to say both the Herodians and the Romans. Again, we see here the lack of sentimentality in Scripture. Poor people have real enemies. They have to deal with palpable hatred, and they need to be rescued from the boot of oppression. The second aspect of the Benedictus I want to point out is the beautiful phrase that concludes it: the giving of light to those who sit in darkness and shadow of death. This phrase is an allusion to 2nd Isaiah's promise that God will bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. In other words, this is a clear reference to the actual circumstances of real political prisoners in both Isaiah's time and Luke's time. Darkness is not an abstract moral notion, it's the literal darkness of those sitting in the empire's dungeons. Notably, Luke's Jesus will allude to this same theme not once but twice more in the gospel. In Jesus' inaugural sermon in Nazareth, and then again when Jesus describes the vocation of John the Baptist. God's work is trying to bring light into the darkness, first and foremost, of locked down by empire. So these two hymns, the Magnificat and the Benedictus, are clearly hymns of resistance that were sung by the oppressed. And we do them such a disservice when we domesticate them into parlor songs for middle class. Finally, on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day comes the Nativity story proper. It is one of the best known folk traditions in Western culture. And yet, it is known mostly only in its domesticated form. So I want to focus on the details of this narrative that we briefly ignore. And here I'm going to briefly go over what we talked about a year ago. I saw this webinar. Once again, Luke has given us a very specific political geography. The setup for the scene of the birth of Jesus is a Roman census that brings Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem. This context is not mere window dressing, offering a random time and space for intrinsically religious drama. Rather, crucial and consequential historical particularity that itself freights meanings for what is to come. Notice here that Caesar is named again, but it is the second figure specified by Luke that gets our attention. Publius Servius Quirinius, who lived from the year 45 of the before the Common Era to the year 21 of the Common Era. Quirinius was a Roman senator who was appointed governor of Syria in the year 6 of the Common Era. Syria was the most important provinces of the Eastern Empire, and his job was to levy a universal tax, for which he first needed to conduct a census. Pictured here is an inscribed potsherd found in southern Egypt, written by a tax collector. It is a receipt for someone who had paid the head tax in the 5th year of the Emperor Claudius, about 4 decades after Quirinius' census. The 2 drachmas per person equaled about 2 daily wages for a skilled worker. Before then, taxes had been paid in kind. Now, however, inhabitants were required to declare their property in money. This was more onerous because a farmer had to borrow in case of a poor harvest. So not only was this Roman head tax impossible to afford for the poor, but the census was a dramatic form of social and political control. As Luke notes, it forced poor people to travel to their place of birth, a profound hardship for many. In Luke's story, Jesus' parents must travel from his hometown in Nazareth in Galilee all the way down to southern Judea in Bethlehem, a long and difficult and dangerous sojourn for any peasant couple, much less for a pregnant woman. And the tax itself was a problem. Any Roman coin would bear an image of the goddess Roma or of the emperor, or a legend saying that the man represented was divine. In other words, it was a violation of at least 2 of the 10 commandments. For these reasons, Quirinius' census was highly controversial in the occupied territories of Palestine. In fact, the ancient historian Josephus tells us that the census occasioned an armed uprising of peasant resistance to Rome. He writes, "A Galilean named Judas incited his countrymen to revolt, upbraiding them as cowards for consenting to pay tribute to the Romans and tolerating mortal masters after having God for their Lord. This revolt was brutally suppressed by the Romans, resulting in increased oppression and resistance that continued right through the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. This Judas, by the way, was so notorious a figure that he's later mentioned by Luke in Acts 5:37. In short, the Jews remembered Quirinius' census as a national disaster. Writing 2 or 3 generations after these events, Luke could assume that every reader knew not only about Quirinius' governorship and what calamity had befallen the nation, but the increase in both oppression and resistance that continued through the time of Jesus of Nazareth and culminated 60 years later in the Roman-Jewish War. In other words, Jesus' world was far more like El Salvador or Afghanistan than like the Disneyland versions that inhabit our first world creche scenes. We're getting lots of feedback that there's too much feedback in the context of Luke's nativity story. And after all of that context, the actual birth of Jesus in Bethlehem is starkly, almost matter-of-factly. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver the child, and she gave birth to her son and wrapped him in bands of cloth, laid him in a manger because there was no place for them at the inn. Now, this scenario has occasioned much debate. The Greek term for inn, kataluma, means literally place where one unharnesses, that is, where one unharnesses animals. It is also the term that Luke uses to describe the guest room in which Jesus and the disciples held the Last Supper. So interestingly, it's a space that effectively brackets the life of Jesus. The kataluma inferred here in Luke 2 was most likely the outer room of a village home where the animals were kept. Usually they were kept sort of in lower quarters and there to keep people warm in the winter. So pictured here is an attempt to recreate such a space that Elaine and I saw a couple of years ago when visiting in the Christian Palestinian village of Taibe. But it seems to me that we typically overlook the real point of this story. Namely, if Bethlehem was Joseph's hometown, where were all his relatives? This was a culture, still is today, of great extended families and profound filial loyalties. Why could Joseph not find lodging? The only plausible explanation is that Joseph's entire family, presumably even his close friends, had been disappeared or displaced by the political turmoil of these revolutionary years. Empire, insurrection, counter-revolution, all move poor people around the landscape like pawns, refugees all. So Joseph returns to his home place and finds no one. The peasant girl Mary gives birth in a hovel, lays her infant in a feed trough. Hardly the stuff of revolution, hope, and yet the very core of the Christian faith. It's deeply significant that Jesus was born in this political geography, for among such spaces and people, the God of the Bible forever reanimates the project of redemption. Because the push and pull of empire that displaced the Holy Family still forces people to leave their homes in order to survive, we rightly remember this story in the liturgy of Posadas, which we invoked at the beginning of this presentation. And in the Posadas Sin Fronteras, the simple act of relocating worship into contested political space helps us recover the Nativity as a real-world saga. These sorts of experiments rescue Christmas from its trivialization by spiritualizing pietism and relentless commercialization, while compelled to confront the hardships so familiar to those forced to become sojourners in order to support their families. For those privileged in a world of violence and exclusion, hearing the pleas of the Joses and Marias on the other side of the border fence, and having to take on the role of the hard-hearted casero, innkeeper, in the Posadas litany, is searing to the heart and to the conscience. This is the Christmas story, both then and now, and we Christians need to get it right. And we should never forget that in Palestine today, it would simply be impossible for Mary and Joseph to get to Bethlehem because of the Israeli walls that have surrounded that town, turning it into a huge open-air prison. So we pray tonight for all our friends in Bethlehem who continue to endure the occupation of their land. There's, of course, much more to say about Luke's nativity story. Part of the reading for Christmas Day is the famous vignette about shepherds in chapter 2, verses 8 and following. This scene, yet again, stresses that those receiving the promise of the new messianic order are those who are lowest on the social ladder. Shepherds in antiquity were widely considered unclean and untrustworthy, particularly by polite Judean society. And yet here they are entrusted with another angelic epiphany. They are directed to look not to Jerusalem palaces for change, but to a feed trough in a backwater village. This is clearly not history as usual. It should also be pointed out that the angelic pronunciamiento declares glory to God in the highest heaven and on earth peace among those who God favors. This is a close mimicry of the Roman propaganda, which glorified the emperor aimed peace or war around the Mediterranean world. But here in Luke, this is not a dispatch from the Pax Romana. It is rather a subversive appropriation of political language to declare a radically different sovereignty. And finally, in the second and last week of the short Christmastide, our reading focuses on the epilogue to Luke's nativity story. Just as that tale began with Zechariah in the temple, so does it conclude with Jesus' presentation and the obligatory temple sacrifices on behalf. here noted as 2 birds, was the minimal acceptable offering required for the poor by the cult. In this space, one final bystander, by Simeon, gives us our third and final canticle, the Nunc Dimittis, which is sung incidentally to Mary. Joseph is nowhere to be found. Imagine yet another strange elder grabbing your child and pronouncing not only blessing, hymn of salvation, but also warning you that there will be violence and tragedy in the future. My, Mary must have been one woman to absorb all this amazing word and deed. In any case, she was stronger than we are, because apparently we can't help but relentlessly sentimentalize and domesticate this tradition, from the warm and the cuddly to the idolatrously patriotic to the popular neocons' fabulated war on Christmas. Let us be very clear, friends. The war on Christmas is not coming from liberal secularists in North America today. It's coming from our own domestication of our own traditions, rooted in our biblical illiteracy and lodged in our desperate efforts to take the nativity story out of the real world and capture it in Disneyland. It's our hope here that disciplines of scripture studies, such as what we've done a little bit tonight in this webinar, can help us push back and reclaim the radical roots of both Advent and Christmas, especially our radical tradition of hymnody, especially under the leadership of women with vision. So speaking of visionary women leaders, and Tim, we're going to bring on Dell now. I want to invite Dell McCormick on to share a little of her and perhaps some thoughts that she might have on these scripture texts. Now, if you want some background on Dell, I'd recommend that you read the 2nd chapter of our God as Undocumented book, in which my co-author Matt Caldwell profiles extraordinary time friend and colleague, and I'm just delighted that she agreed to talk to us tonight. Dell currently serves in a variety of capacity around immigrant rights, which has preoccupied much of her life. She recently finished an interim pastorate at the First Christian Church of Arizona. Until 2010, Dell was the executive director of Border Links there, an immigrant education and solidarity organization. She's a longtime missionary with the United Church of Christ, worked for many years at the Cornell Center for Intercultural Dialogue on Development in Mexico, and she did work in classes of San Cristobal in Chiapas at a very crucial time. So, Dell, welcome, and perhaps you can just take a minute and fill in a little bit of your biography, both past and present, for folks who might be familiar with you. Welcome.
Thank you. I think it's important for people to know that I came from wealthy roots, and because of the experience in Mexico at CID, the Cornell Center for Intercultural Dialogue on Development, which is a reverse mission, cross-cultural experience, during the sanctuary movement, I came home and was even more unhappy with the wealthy life that I lived in New York City. So that's an important piece. When I get frustrated about people not changing, about this hard-hearted, stiff-necked people, I think myself, and people can change if there's a good process and accompaniment, I think so. I still work on issues of immigration, even though I'm not paid to do it. I'm a volunteer for the Samaritans, which is a group that works to save migrants in the desert, giving water and food and accompaniment. And I do pastoral care. And I work with a local clinic that works with low-income, high-risk patients. Some are migrants, most of them from the South. Looking at the multiple health issues that result from crossing the desert, from coming without documents, I call it differently documented, help them have a whole life here, because they come quite fractured, fragmented, shattered, crushed because of their journey through the desert and what has preceded it.
Thanks, Del. You mentioned that you left an affluent lifestyle in New York City to work with the poor in Mexico and Central America at a time, of course, that was hotly contested during the insurgency and counterinsurgencies in Central America. Could you just say a little bit more about some of the highlights of that journey? It's chronicled in the chapter in Our God is Undocumented, but there are a few things that you could say would give our listeners a little bit of taste of your amazing journey.
Yeah, that wasn't an easy trip. I was not happy working or not working as an actor. I think I didn't work more than I worked. I wasn't happy with my wealthy lifestyle, even though I had been born and bred to have that. I felt entrapped by it and quite unhappy. And when I went to Mexico in 1989 for the time with my Presbyterian Quaker church, I just saw reality, and I saw church as an agent of change. I came home and started recycling. I read your book, Binding the Strong Man, with my church, and we took a whole read it, and I was really very, very serious about discerning how to put down that wealth and find power in another way. I quit working, or not working, seeking work as an actor, and went to Philadelphia and worked in a farmer's market there in Wayne, Pennsylvania, for 2 years, selling vegetables to try to figure out what power really meant, while I kept going back and forth to Mexico and thinking, oh my God, don't send me to Mexico. Don't make me give up everything. And do I have to give up my friends and my family? Making that kind of choice would result, I did get a divorce. In fact, I think my family did. My daughter thought I was a member of a cult as I started letting go of things, and I was so happy. That's the paradox, I think, is that when involved, as I did, at a grassroots level, there is sadness, this great sadness at meeting the reality of the people, but there's also a joy in actually walking with people, even if you can't do anything besides walk with them. There's great value and accompaniment. And so one step at a time, I found my way to Mexico. At my middle year of seminary, I went down to study Spanish and ended up staying 1.5 years and working for the Center for Intercultural Dialogue on Development, where I'd gone as a participant in 1989. I came back to seminary, got arrested a few times, for trying to close the School of Americas. I kept going back down to Mexico, doing discernment, all the while dreading that I would really have to take this giant step. And I finally did, but one step at a time. It was really absolutely wonderful, wonderful news. As you know, I went to Cuernavaca and was the director there of that retreat center. And we worked with First World people, Canadians, and U.S. It was very interesting to work with Canadians as well as U.S. that came down to Mexico on this reverse mission, cross-cultural experience. We tried to provide them with what I called a vocation with Christ instead of a vacation with Christ. You know how seminary students and people from churches, local groups will come down and feel really good about building that house or the encounter they have with the poor, and they met God, and many of us were really profoundly changed during the sanctuary movement, and that's of great value. But we began to look at how are the people on the ground that we're encountering, how are they also transformed? If it's not a mutually transformational relationship, then something's really wrong. So we did really exciting work at SID, and many people changed their lives as a result of that. But I had this niggling feeling. I have a sense of call that is about 5-year cycle, and the administration of running a center and the finances and the personnel, human resources stuff was just, I was just sick of it, literally, after 5 years. And I fasted and prayed and said, okay, God, here I am, take me. I can do this next thing. And of course, nothing happened that weekend that I was fasting and praying until I broke my fast and was eating supper and the phone rang. And it was the missionary in Chiapas who had just gotten deported. Because at that time, Chiapas was a low-intensity war zone. The Catholic diocese there, with whom the United Church of Christ was in ministry, was considered an enemy of the state. And she said, we want you to come down and do this work. And I thought, oh my God, I had said to somebody a few weeks before that I'd really wanted to work with some radical nuns in the mountains, and here that was, and I was just scared to death about it. But I just took a step at a time and went down. And I think that experience was the most transformational of my entire life. I worked with a grassroots women's organization called CODIMU, the Coordinación Diocesana de la Mujer, of 10,000 Mayan women, 7 different dialects. And I got to walk with them and learn from them. And they read the Bible with ojos, mente y corazón de mujer, the eyes, the mind, and the heart of women. I'd done feminist theology study, and this just was theology, feminist theology on the ground. It was fabulous, and I learned a lot more than I ever taught. I did healing and transforming trauma work. They taught me a lot about Jesus on the ground and Mary on the ground, and so that's, I want to give a pause if you have some more questions, but that's basically how I went from that place in New York City to Chiapas, and then of course back to the border, with border links and beyond. I would have had a stroke if I knew where I would have ended up, if I thought about that in the very beginning. But I think that one step at a time, and with accompaniment, people can make those changes.
Thanks, Dill. You mentioned your work with women, particularly in Chiapas, and how transformative that is. I'm just both on the text we look at tonight and or stories from some of the women that you worked with during those perhaps still work with today.
Well, the women of Chiapas are definitely the ones that are conscientized, the ones that have been working with the diocese for over 10 years to study the history, the reality that they live, to do critical analysis of what was happening to them, what was happening, who the players were. They were so aware that they were living with the empire. And I would go to meetings where we never started a Bible study without doing a reflection on, it's called a coyuntura, what's happening on the ground right now, who are the players, and then how are we called to respond to that. These women who were mostly not formally educated certainly knew a lot more about what was going on in their communities and in Mexico and in the world than a lot of our college graduates did. And I would go to these meetings and we would do analysis, and this is usually the evil empire. They would always say people, but the systems and structures during and when we went to war with Iraq, and it was so present that they were in the throes of empire, and what would the empire do next, and the about it moving to Chiapas and this neoliberal economics that came New York City, and the heart of the empire was spreading cancer to the whole world, and what would they do in their local communities. So we worked with the Bible, but as Gustavo Gutierrez said, the Bible on one hand and the newspaper in the other. I used to go home from these meetings and my mantra was, oh my God, my God, my God, because it was so overwhelming to be a U.S. citizen there, what the U.S. was doing in the world, the globality we're so involved with. And the women, first of the poor there, got educated in the Bible. I was with women the first time they touched the Bible, were allowed to see that there were women in the Bible. We're so important stories in the Bible that they took up the gospel. You know, I talk about the gospel of Chiapas, and they carried it. Some of them went to the United Nations, to Washington. They go to the G8 meetings. These are women that were afraid to speak up to their husbands who names called besides their name, you know, as woman, had become activists and advocates, and some of them were killed for it. Some of them were beaten to death for it. You know, I was with women when they were surrounded after the massacre of Acteal, and they moved the military, the Mexican military, back simply with sticks, with men completely armed, moving the military back. So the force of women together was really impressive to me. And I came home, the last mass that I celebrated in the city there of Acteal, where the massacre was. You know, I had said to them, why should I preach and why should I concelebrate if you can't? And they said, Hermana has to do it. You know, you have to do it, and then we could do it. So I always preached when I went out in the communities. In those days, the new pope came into control, and often concelebrated masses. And in that mass, the priest, we just invaded Iraq, and the priest took his stole off and put it on me, and he said, "You can't be a missionary to our people, and now we send you home to be a missionary to your own." And that, of course, just struck horror into my heart. You know, I think that that's the hard thing, is to go home. But they said, you've worked long enough here now. You need to go home and take the gospel of Chiapas home. I remember one time talking with women, and we were simply doing some healing and transforming trauma work. I also did biblical interpretation, that organizational piece of do with it. But we were just doing movements outside, some Tai Chi, and the military was watching us from up on the hill, which we didn't realize, but it was very, very militarized. And soon the military actually invaded the community and came to us and surrounded us. They thought that we were trained. They thought these little women who were like 4 feet tall because of malnutrition, and me towered over them. They thought training, you know, for warfare, and we had to take our word because we were scared, which I think is really remarkable and shows that power of Mary, that power of the Annunciation, that it really, the rich and powerful quiver in their boots when they see that. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and something that's really informed my ministry since. And of course, 10% of the people that cross this border in Arizona say that they're from Chiapas. So I often see women in the Traje. We have lots of women and children crossing the desert here, dying the desert. So the same people that I served there, I also serve here in Arizona.
Del, you mentioned a couple of times now that you've been working on issues of trauma and post-traumatic stress, particularly with victims of political violence. Work came to you as you were working in particular. I want to say just a bit more about that, because I think that's something that you work in, and it's such an important area that activists don't always understand or appreciate.
Okay, well, this is what I know from my own experience. When I went to Chiapas, 10 city war zone, I was not documented. I couldn't get documents to live in, so I had to lie about what I was doing. I said I was teaching Spanish. When I Chicago, you know, in my emails, I couldn't write or talk to anyone on the phone. My phone line was tapped. because the diocese was an enemy of the state, even mainly working on ecumenical issues, and I was still working with an enemy of the Mexican state, and I didn't know who else, knew who the enemy was there, but we were told the same way home, to be very careful if someone was watching. And I remember I had a camera, and if Uncle was laid out in front, go and stand over him and, pretend was taking his picture so that, if it was a government spy on me, the of what he was doing in his picture. My broken into, cigarettes were inserted in the matchbox that I lit my stove with, and it was a very terrifying time. I was there alone. I worked with a gringuita, and sleeping. I was on the edge, as so many of us are. This kind of work, I was getting sort of, and my best self, certainly. I was exhausted all the time, and then 9/11 happened, and there happened to be two from a group called Capacitar there at the time that 9/11 happened, and they were doing a workshop for us on healing and transforming trauma. I'd met them before and had worked with some of their, started sleeping better, and they trained to train other people that work in Chiapas, because convinced be actively engaged in changing the world unless you're also actively engaged in your own well-being, because doing harm to ourselves and harm to people with whom we are in or organizing work. And so it's essential that we have some tools in our toolkit that when we start to get burned out, that compassion fatigue, which we all get, when we reach, we know how to take care of ourselves. I don't mean just, people take time off, Well, sometimes you can only take a minute off, and this kind of, it's a real privilege to take time off. If you have tools that help you stay alive, then you can get through it and help other people and be better for it and laugh, along the way, which is important. So I train people to do there. I do that order. I do it when I find people who have been lost in the desert for 15 or 16 days. Some of the techniques are really, I do it with people who are incarcerated, I do it with people in the hospital, and I do it with people who in years who suddenly find themselves incarcerated because misdemeanor. They're facing deep. Can't say strong enough how important it is in these kind of activities. It gives extra years, and we can continue to do this instead of like working really hard for 5 years and then getting burnt out and not doing it any longer. I'm actually working with a group right now who have been here for 10 to 15 years, most of them whose health is really compromised by the life that might face by the 10 to 70, the things on the border, with Spirit for Life, figure out a way to live in all of this. Holistic for well-being. How's that?
Well, thank you, Del, for just a few vignettes from an amazing life, and it's just such a privilege on this webinar. Thank you for agreeing to share a little bit. We're going to take the last 15 minutes now to open it up for questions or comments. Already the Portland crew is no doubt echoing everyone's sentiments about the amazing journey that you've had, Del. Whoever wants to offer questions or comment, they're open. You can direct them either concerning the presentation or Del. Del, while you're doing that, or while questions, I'm wondering if you had, I know a lot about this because you've been in the work of solidarity and accompaniment for so many years. What would you say are the most important characteristics for of privilege to learn in the journey of solidarity?
Well, the first one that we told people at SID, and it often made them, was we were the Cuernavaca Center for Dialogue and Development. And so people thought that they were going to come down and talk a lot about themselves as well as hearing stories. And they would get really frustrated and say, "You're going to listen to us, you know." And I have always said that the first for people is to listen. Listen and listen. And when I went the first 2 years, nobody had seen my curriculum vitae. I just listened. In some ways, it was disempowering, but it was kind of fly. And then I got in. Then people said they could see my heart and they trusted me. So I would say that ability to really listen, and secondly, to need instead of assuming that we need. I think it's the mistakes that folks make when they do this kind of. We know how to fix that problem. I read that many of the answers are already there in Latin America or in the global South. We just listen to them, work with them to figure out how to make those things work. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to look at some of the questions here.
Now, up in Ontario, good to have you on board, Kyle. Has a question about the language of barrenness and its relation to contemporary theology of the womb, and others may have thoughts on this, but just a biblical note about the rhetoric of barrenness in the Hebrew Bible. It's a longer discussion, of course, but understand that this late Bronze Age understood correlation between the fertility of land and the fertility of the womb, and so oftentimes similar language was about fruitfulness, fertility, or lack thereof. I think in the midst of texts, probably that agricultural metaphor tends to prevail. Fertility was seen as a gift of the cosmology of grace, and sometimes it was there and sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes when it was not there in the land, it was the result either of depredation of the land or of the unfaithfulness of people. And similarly, if fertility isn't there in people in these old texts, it is often correlated either to depredation or to the unfaithfulness of people. So that doesn't solve all the problems, but might be a helpful analogy. And now that the questions are coming fast and furious, Jennifer Henry, who is the executive director of Kairos, who we talked about earlier in the webinar. By the way, do you know each other by any chance? No? Okay, well, that's got to happen sometime. I'd love for you to meet each other. Jennifer's saying that the men in Lucan texts begin speaking again when I've been intrigued by Bridget Call, who talks about uniformity and using the key of the text given its primacy. Yeah, I think that is for sure the case. The fact that it's the first of the three canticles, the fact that it's this major discourse, really the longest discourse in single discourse in the whole Nativity story, rightly suggests that it can be a sort of a hermeneutic key tool. Interesting, though, is that the men never really take on the Nativity narrative, even at the end when Simeon is singing his song, his Nunc Dimittis. He's addressing it to Mary. He's talking to Mary about Mary, so that women remain the center of the subjects. And in the patriarchal world of ancient, these things are pretty all things considered. I think the next one is to you. My understanding is that the pastoral is particularly celebrated among indigenous communities in southern Arizona. I know years ago I had to witness one of those fiestas. They've also been used in some Chicano, Latino conscientized communities, in part addressing Portland's concern. How do we appropriate these stories and liturgically appropriate the real story? Anything you want to say about the pastoral tradition that's deeply embedded in literature? Thank you. Del, I'm noting that our friend Nikki up in the Pacific Northwest asked about whether it might have been the perceived scandal of Mary's betrothed pregnancy that was the reason why her relatives would not receive her. That, of course, has been the conventional view. Luke makes no real allusion to scandal in his story. That is very present in Matthew's story, which is why Matthew's genealogy names 4 different women in the genealogy. Very unusual thing to do in a patriarchal genealogy, to name 4 women, all of whom had questionable backgrounds, as if Matthew is laying the groundwork for people who might not believe the tale of divine immaculate conception. I really think in Luke's story that the implication more is that this is just a community that's been shattered, and it's the thing that doesn't often get talked about, and it doesn't get talked about. We'd rather focus only on issues of personal morality rather than the political landscape of the story. Jeff Thigpen has given a URL on the possible. Jennifer's talking about her church at Holy Trinity, where they are active in these issues. And Jennifer, I'd be very interested to hear how the use of posadas is going in the cold north. Your Kairos resource. Yeah, sounds like a fitting cap. We've got about 4 more minutes, so that sounds like a Nativity story to close with.
I got a call Christmas morning a few years ago, as I often do different mornings, saying that someone is in the hospital and that I needed to go there and talk, give them pastoral accompaniment. And this message said baby help. So I went up to the NICU at our local. There was baby Jesus. He had been born in the desert. He weighed 4 pounds. His mother, and we'll call her Maria, was from Honduras, and she had left 4 children behind who were slowly dying, starving. Both of her husbands had come to the U.S. as migrants and had been killed here or disappeared or met a woman and left her. So the only option she had to feed her children was to take the train. 8 months pregnant, and taking the train means riding on the Iron Beast, those trains riding on top of the freight trains, for miles up through Central America and Mexico. And she said she would weave her arms around the ladder and hang her belly out, and she thought that the Iron Beast would shake that baby out of her. She ended up getting to the border, which was a miracle, because she died on the way. Had in the middle of the night. It was 32 degrees. It was starting to snow, which does in Arizona. The group went to find the 5-year-old girl with her when she gave birth. Patrol came to help her. They did not pick up the placenta, would show that the baby was and give him citizenship. They sent her to detention, where she slept on the floor for the really cold cell without any medication. Him to the very upscale neonatal intensive care unit at the University Hospital here in Tucson. They were reunited on Christmas Day. And she had an order of deportation. It would kill him for him to fly because his lungs weren't developed. She was able to stay here for a month legally while he grew a little bit. She ended up fleeing. So I want to just say that baby Jesus is out there somewhere, and occasionally she will call me from wherever she is in the U.S. to see how I'm doing, and I always ask her how she is and how baby Jesus is. Jesus is 3 now, and I wonder if he will have the wherewithal to be all that Jesus was, and what we're doing for the baby Jesuses of today that are crossing the desert. This man without a country, that was returning to country that was once Mexico's, was once, not the U.S.'s. So I leave that with our listeners to think about and maybe tell that story. The story is on the web. If they Google it with my name and baby Jesus, I think that it will come up, or they can email me and I'll send them a copy of the story.
Sorry, I just made an announcement there and I was muted. Del, I want to thank you for the input that you've given us. Mil gracias. You have offered so much. Thank you for your life and for your witness over the years. You are truly who lives in the spirit of the Magnificat. So thank you for your contribution tonight. If you want Del's story chapter in the book, Google her. She's in Tucson, and she can help you if you're interested in volunteering and work down in the. So, Del, thank you very much. Bless you. I want to just remind you now that Tim has, I believe, put up a link up in the notes. Are they at the bottom there, Tim?
Yep, they're up.
Yeah, you put them. Tim's going to make available the notes. We do have the link to the survey, so we'd really appreciate it if you fill out the survey online. You see the link up there. I also want to say to everybody that those of you who've been waiting for the next round of webinars, we have now announced the first 3 webinars for next year. The first will be on January 16th. It's called Following Jesus in the Way of Dr. King, a Martin Luther King birthday special. That'll be the day after King's birthday. The year 2013 is going to see a lot of 50th anniversary commemorations of the very consequential year of 1963 for the civil rights movement. So this is going to be the first of several webinars that we do next year exploring these themes. We hope to have on this January webinar Ed Loring and Murphy Davis of the Open Door community in Atlanta, and also Nelson and Joyce Johnson of the Beloved Community Center in Greensboro to talk with us about how Dr. King has influenced their ministries. February's webinar is going to be on Luke and Sabbath economics. We're going to try an experiment. We're always experimenting with this platform. We're going to try to do a live peek into our Bartimaeus Institute. We're going to be running the Institute from the 18th to the 22nd in February. If you're interested or know people who are, you can find that link on either of our websites. This webinar will be one of the sessions broadcast live on the webinar. So note the special time. It'll be earlier in the afternoon to correspond with one of the sessions. So for those of you who can't make it to the Institute, this will be a chance to join the circle. And finally, in March, we are going to prepare for Palm Sunday, which falls on March 24th next year, by reframing the so-called triumphal entry as radical street theater. So we'll look at revisioning Palm Sunday, Jesus' march on Jerusalem, in its political and economic context. So that is our next 3 webinars. We hope that each of you will continue to spread the word. We're so grateful, as always, that you have listened in and participated. We're going to keep trying to expand the circle of voice participants as we get more familiar with the technology. For now, we're gonna close out with thanks to folks spread all across North America, Australia, and even Scandinavia. Thanks for joining us, and we wish you a very blessed and recovered radical Christmas tide. Thank you, and God bless.